Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is the 36th meetup that we're organizing in New York, in the New York chapter of the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. It's a very timely, very important topic. And this morning, as I was reflecting on what we'll be discussing and the panelists, it occurred to me that it's very, very unusual for a grassroots community like ours to have a panel that has the depth of expertise and experience and the perspective that our panelists this afternoon have. But that's precisely why we started this community, to bridge the gap between people who are looking at the issues from a very strategic, high level, very senior perspective, and then people who are at the very, at the opposite end of the spectrum, who are building startups, maybe haven't even raised their first round yet, are thinking about where they'll get their first customer from, their first round of financing. But the issues are important enough that it's important for the folks at the strategic level to understand what the folks at the grassroots level, so to speak, are thinking about and working on. And our thinking is that once those kinds of conversations start to happen, then there can be a meeting in the happy medium. So this community has existed now for 5 years. It was on the 23rd of August, 2017, that I was sitting at my desk and thought, oh my God, I need to go to a supply chain meetup, and quickly persuaded Lisa to join me in starting the
I recall it was a frantic, oh my God, I did a thing, help me.
Help. That's what it was.
And I said, you started a company, yay.
It's now 4,800 plus members around the world, a number of chapters getting going. The community in Southern California is really putting us to shame in New York recently. They've been really active. New York is a flagship chapter. So New York now has roughly more than 3,000 members. And there's 2 new chapters in formation, one probably in Toronto starting soon, and one in Milan. And the community formed what was one aspect of our investment thesis for REFASHIOND Ventures, which is also a fund that's in formation. I think we're now at 23 investments, and probably by the end of September should be at about 25. So that's the context, the community, the fund. Supply chain is going to be the issue of the day for the foreseeable future, maybe for the rest of this century. That's the context. And so without much further ado, I'm going to ask our speakers this afternoon to tell us a little bit about themselves. And I'll go in alphabetical order. I'll start with Jackie, who in my research this afternoon, I discovered has a PhD, so I should actually be referring to her as Dr. Jackie Deal. Jackie, when I spoke with you, you talked about your interest in history, or at least my memories that we talked about how history plays into how societies and nations think about themselves in relation to the rest of the world. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that and what you do at the Long-Term Strategy Group and the American Academy for Strategic Education.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to Lisa and the whole REFASHIOND community. And I hope to meet some of you in person someday, but in lieu of that, I hope you're having a great week. And Brian had originally mentioned that people might be interested in hearing about the Chinese reaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and what to make of that episode in terms of supply chain security, and I'm happy to come back to that or address it. I suspect it's on people's minds, but I think when we talk about supply chains and the US-China relationship today and thinking about how things may evolve going forward, we should go back to a particular episode from March of 2020, early in the coronavirus pandemic, when Xinhua, the Chinese state media outlet, published an article that basically explained that the United States was very dependent on China for masks, for imports of the masks we needed to protect ourselves from the virus, and also stated something like, if China were to ban the export of drugs to our hospitals, then, quote, the United States would sink into the hell of the new novel coronavirus pandemic. Mm-hmm. So that was a kind of bracing moment, I think, for a lot of people who had been watching the evolution of the Chinese economy and the Chinese military and the US-China relationship, and had been thinking about how are things going to evolve in terms of US-China relations. I think it was a wake-up call maybe, or I'd like to call it that, but I'm not quite sure how much waking up we've done. So maybe let's put a kind of placeholder on that thought. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it shouldn't have been so surprising, because back in 2010, some of you may remember, there was another moment when there was a collision at sea between what Chinese media described as a fishing boat captain, or a drunken fishing boat captain, but someone who many people think was actually a Chinese maritime militia captain. And he collided with a Japanese vessel, and Japan, in a kind of law-abiding, legalistic fashion, took him back to Japan for legal proceedings. And Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, objected vociferously to this. And the next thing you knew, the exports of rare earth minerals to Japan, which are critical for Japan's exports and manufacturing economy, slowed down from the mainland. And so again, that was another kind of wake-up call moment where people started to think, is there going to be a weaponization of economic relations, China's leverage over important elements of the supply chain? Is this something that we need to worry about and secure ourselves against? And it was maybe a challenging wake-up call for us, or for the Western liberal world, insofar as everybody on the call knows, this kind of security thinking around economic interactions and trade and supply chain has become, I think, foreign to us. We have come to rely on the notion that basically markets work, just in time is great. The invisible hand will allocate demand and supply in such a way that everyone will prosper. And that would be great. That's great for everyone, because then there will be peace as people do well. And so there's not really a kind of problem around securing supply chains or thinking about the security of supply chains. That's maybe old-fashioned thinking, or nonsensical, non-economic, irrational thinking. The right way to think about supply chain is in this kind of very kind of liberal, free market, laissez-faire, invisible hand kind of a way. Mm-hmm. Whereas, as many people I know on this call understand, that's the Chinese Communist Party sees its role as shepherding the Chinese Communist Party and securing the wealth and power of the People's Republic of China. And the wealth and the power go together. And therefore you can't take for granted supply chain security or economic security. That's definitely a role for the state, which is why people have talked about Chinese state capitalism or China neo-mercantilism. It's a very different outlook from the one I think that we've come to embrace, in the West, or the liberal West, or the rules-based international order, if you will.
Mhm.
So,
Let me bring David here, because I think it's a great point at which to get his perspective. So David, tell us a little bit about your background, and Jackie, I'm going to come back to asking about your background a little bit, because I think it's interesting to know just enough about that to put your comments in perspective. But David, your background, both working for Fortune 500 companies and helping them tackle with problems in their supply chain, in the context of your military service in the United Kingdom, and then now as founder and chief strategic officer for Everstream Analytics. You know, what are we talking about here? So Jackie made the reference to economic power, trade flows, and that sort of thing. What's at stake? How big a problem is this? How much have we shifted from, you know, manufacturing things ourselves to now relying entirely on China for that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. Well, and as Jackie said, thank you, Brian and Lisa, for the invitation. Certainly a great panel, an important topic. I think there's a few things to check down that list you have there. Not a ton to add about me and my career. Jumped out of perfectly serviceable aeroplanes when I was in the Army, so odd that I would end up in risk management. I think I'm on my 6th startup now.
Oh, wow.
So been at sort of supply chain risk for about 10, 15 years now. And we're 4 or 5 years into Everstream Analytics, which we got here primarily through acquiring a couple of the leading supply chain risk analytics companies. And our core belief is that almost any supply chain decision will be a better decision if risk can be taken into account. But that's easy to say, and it's actually very hard to do, particularly the way that supply chain risk has been managed, if it has, over the last decade or so. And so our platform is designed to help companies predict and see and act on risk during planning and execution throughout all phases of source, make, and deliver. And so sometimes we're at the strategic level when we're thinking about supply chain risk. Sometimes we're at a very tactical level with our clients. And when we think about this type of geopolitical risk and the other types of risks that interact with it, as you pointed out, climate risk is it's an important variable here. And there's plenty of history of where extreme climate, water is an obvious example, have led to wars over the centuries. So it is nothing new, but it's certainly a bigger and different form of what we're seeing now in terms of how climate is starting to and will increasingly impact geopolitical risk. I mean, I think the sort of headline here in terms of trade flows is just that there is an enormous amount of trade flowing between the US and China. I think last year it was over 650 billion, and most of that is exports coming from China into the US. And when we think about geopolitical risk and the numbers at stake here, if we take this to an extreme and say, well, what if trade ceased between the US and China? And we just did, mathematically looked at that. The OECD's got a database that looks at trade and value-added economic losses. So based on that database, the loss for China, if the trade ended between China and the US, would be about $450 billion. For the US, more like $270 billion. You add in EU and Japan, and it's 2.6 trillion in aggregate. So these are very, very big numbers, but that's an extreme outcome. The likelihood is that it's not going to be that, but it's going to be somewhere between where we are today and something more extreme. And it's as you said earlier, it's difficult to have a discussion about the US and China and Southeast Asia without thinking about Taiwan. And we look at the we look at the trade of goods, of finished products, and we think about consumer electronics, appliances, clothing, and furniture in one direction, and then agricultural products and aircraft and turbines and things in the other direction. But as Jackie pointed out, there are other things that might not have as big a volume, but may strategically be more important. So active pharmaceutical ingredients is a good example of that, where even if there's a lot of generic drugs that are made in India, but the APIs are coming primarily, almost exclusively from China. The automotive industry is always a good poster child for supply chain complexity. And we've witnessed over the last couple of years that, if you don't have a chip or you don't have X or Y, you can't make the car. And a lot of automotive inputs are coming from China. And of course, you go back to Taiwan and you start thinking about semiconductors, and over 60% of the semiconductor supply is coming out of Taiwan. 90% if you narrow it down to really high-end chips. So the dependencies, the interdependencies, the volumes, the value are enormous. And anyone who talks about decoupling is really, I don't want to say it's unrealistic or it's never going to happen, but to the extent it's going to happen in certain ways, in certain industries, and it's going to happen very slowly, even with tailwinds that will continue to provide incentives for companies to become more regional and more diversified. But the interaction with China it's not going away. It's essentially here to stay, even if it changes in its form.
Thank you. On that note, Anna, I'd like to bring you in and get your take on this. Given your focus on counterintelligence, and again, just as with David and with Jackie, please give the audience a little bit about your background and some of the work you've done in the past. But given your focus on counterintelligence, how should startup founders, especially technology startup founders, people who are running small businesses, what do we need to know about the nature of counterintelligence, how the CCP and China approach this? Is this something that they should be concerned at all, or can we blissfully go about what we're doing and leave people like you guys on the panel to worry about this, and the rest of us can enjoy life as usual, or we can worry about other things?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Brian and Lisa, for the invitation to address this great group and these panelists. So a little bit about my background. I spent 20 years with the government, and then now I'm currently a director of biotech programs at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown. And, I was really taken with the title, The New Cold War, because there's been a lot of discussion about that. And I think what is really striking, especially, when we talk about supply chains, we talk about some of the challenges or the, not necessarily disparities, but conflict areas. It's really kind of redefining that space and what is national security, right? As we think about, because we don't normally think of, bio and some of these other areas as that. But a colleague of mine really described like academia and commerce, especially smaller companies, as it's the new geopolitical battle space. And that's really, I think, important to remember, because we don't really think like that in open democracies, right? I mean, we think of a globalized world where everyone has the same drivers. And I think especially for our small businesses, it's really important to remember we're dealing with an entirely different system. Just because it has university or company or court in the name doesn't mean it acts or functions the same as ours. And it's a really structural difference, right down to the kinds of laws, the kinds of rules, the kind of regulations. And I'm sure anyone trying to do business in the China market bumps right up against that, right? Whether it be market access issues, issues regarding collaborations. And so I think it's always really important in all the dealings is to really remember that, these really inherently different systems. And really the role of CCP, I mean, as Jackie was talking about, I mean, this is a much more holistic system than what we deal with, where the lines between the state and private and academia and the military are really blurred. And so, having an understanding of that network, or even, understanding that it's a much more holistic approach to some of these things. And then we see that with tensions rising, and then not only things like rare earths, and the masks, but also during COVID, I mean, basic research, commodities such as pipette tips, gloves, and even non-human primates were all withheld from the global markets.
As I was going to, thank you, Anna. I thought when I was outlining this that I'd bring Gentry in next, but I think based on Anna's comments, I think I'll jump to Isaac and then come to Gentry at the end. But Isaac, I was reading America Second, and the thing that struck me is how in almost every industry, it seemed as if the people in charge are being co-opted somehow. And so I thought it would be interesting for you to give a synopsis, one from the perspective of America Second, but then based on your other work. How should we be thinking about China versus the CCP? And then, talk about some of the ways in which the CCP does what it does. I'm trying not to steal your thunder. I'm trying not to steal your thunder by giving things away. But the one thing that struck me, one comment that struck me was when Brad Pitt said I'm basically just a guy who puts on makeup. How do we get to the point where someone describes themselves like, this is a really well accomplished actor, you'd expect him to describe himself in more Flanagan? He says, no, I'm really just a guy who puts on makeup, and just leave me out of this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for having me. So the anecdote you're referring to really elucidates Hollywood's deep relationship with the CCP. It's arguably the most pro-Beijing sector of US society. And the work that I do, both in the writing and in a company that I run, which I'll get into in a second, really tries to look at relations between US and global corporations and the CCP, and then how to minimize and reduce both the ties and also the risks associated with those ties, which is very intertwined with questions of supply chains. So I'm a former journalist. I lived in Beijing for 6 years. Wrote a book called America Second, which looks at Beijing's influence in the United States and how to push back without being McCarthyist or racist. And I run a research company called Strategy Risks, which quantifies exposure to China and ranks companies and institutions on their exposure to the CCP. I think in terms of these issues, it is really important to distinguish between China, which has been around for more than 5,000 years, and the Chinese Communist Party, which has ruled for 73 of those years, so 1.5%. And to understand that if we are taking the supposed long view that the Chinese like to pretend that the Communist Party always takes, they're just a blip in the pan here, to mix a few metaphors. And that, I think, needs to underpin our conversations about the subjects. The issue isn't with Chinese people, it's with the Chinese Communist Party. It's not even with the government, it's with the party, which is controlled, which controls the government. They're separate entities. I think in terms of the direct relationship with supply chains, the issue tends to be less the problem with Chinese goods coming into the United States, which are far easier to look at, to trace, and much more with US corporate dependencies on China and the Chinese market, which distorts market values and makes it more difficult for American companies to both act in American interests, but also to get government contracts and to get government work. So a lot of the work that we do in this space is helping companies trace their supply chains in China and helping them understand, in the face of a very non-transparent market, what their suppliers' relationship are with, say, the United Front or the Ministry of State Security or the Communist Party's army, the People's Liberation Army, or Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where upwards of 1 million Muslims have been held in concentration camps. So it's a lot of, how do we think about these issues? How do we gather the right type of data and the right type of information that clarifies some really, really knotty problems?
Mm-hmm. But the one issue that I find fascinating in the book is this idea of and I was trying to come up with a way of framing it, but the use of influence to get what the party, to get what there's actually one, I forget who it's in relation, but it's basically the party wants you to know what the party wants without the party having to tell you what the party. So it's that. Could you talk about that phenomenon a little bit?
Definitely. For so long, we've scoffed at Chinese propaganda, seeming it as obvious and transparently manipulative. But we've missed the far more effective aspects of Beijing's propaganda and Beijing's influence campaigns, which is getting other people, namely Americans, namely powerful former military or government officials, to speak positively about the Communist Party is a far more effective way of transmitting Communist Party propaganda. And that's often done through a secretive organization called the United Front, which works to amplify positive voices about China and suppress negative voices, or to strengthen the party's friends and to weaken its enemies. Mm-hmm. So the issue is less that someone will read an article from the nationalistic tabloid, the Global Times, and say, oh, this is a very smart article, I'm going to share this, and far more that they will read something that Henry Kissinger or William Cohen or frankly also Madeleine Albright has said about China, or Stephen Schwartzman or Ray Dalio, and then they'll spread that information because, oh, brilliant investor, Ray Dalio, I'm sure everything he says about China must be very smart and must come from a position of intellectual independence, while forgetting the very sophisticated ways that the party is able to enmesh itself into these influence networks.
That's fascinating. We'll come back to that a little later. Gentry, so cybersecurity. Mostly when we think about cybersecurity, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think in the United States, when we think about cybersecurity, it's often Russia is who we should be afraid of. But in thinking about this topic, I started to wonder, is that entirely accurate? Is it still the fact that Russia is the biggest threat when it comes to cybersecurity, or is that a holdover from a quaint period that is well in the past? And again, like with everyone else, tell us a bit about your background, about ANOVA intelligence and all that good stuff.
Thanks, and thanks for including me in this August panel. I'm Gentry Lane. I'm the CEO and founder of ANOVA Intelligence. We're a cyber national security company. I'm a fellow at the Potomac Institute and a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute, where I write and publish on cyber conflict strategy. And I work with NATO as well in a couple different capacities, or represent the US at NATO. We should be very afraid of Russia. We should be more afraid of China. They're both formidable adversaries. The major threat actors, there's four big ones: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Yeah, we should be terrified of them. We're certainly outnumbered. They're absolutely our peer in terms of capabilities. But just in terms of scale, there's more of them than there are of us. Our cyber command, the US has a combatant command, dedicated combatant command for offensive and defensive cyber operations, 7,000 people. the best in the world. China has the PLA has 100,000 people in their cyber command. They also have a really sophisticated sort of feeder system of education and research and development, that a better pipeline for talent.
Mhm. And so what can we do about this? I mean,
And yeah,
that sounds frightening. What's the role for the private sector working with governments?
yeah,
Is that happening?
I have
Is
a
that
slightly
happening?
different question.
it's to say
How-
nothing. We're
how
all
do
going
we-
to die.
Yeah. How do we have a chance when literally TikTok, like they're so smart, they've given away all of our data and all of our access, and our government has no idea how to regulate or defend against this. So where do we start?
Well, you don't need TikTok to get all of our data. You can purchase it. It's like $85,000, and you can buy a really deep data set. So data expires. Don't worry so much about that. And that they're really not interested in us as individuals. Those massive data purchases are to train their algorithms. We should worry about that later. What was your question, Brian, also that you said?
No,
Oh, yes. How does the civilian sector? Yeah. No, they're, how do I say this nicely?
For example, just the other day, I think it was even maybe just yesterday, Twitter was in the news, right? Marge made he made a complaint, and that was all over the news. How do we bridge that gap between the reality that there's so much risk out there in the world, just like you described, and what's happening in companies? If let's say not everything Marge alleged is correct, but even if
it is
a third of what he alleged is correct, that's still very worrying.
I think there's probably more. I think he only alleged the very serious things. Or not, I think I know and work with him. Yeah, there's really no excuse for a company of that size and that resources not to have the best cybersecurity practices. All of our financial institutions do have that, have the level that we want. Of course, social media should be at that level as well. However, even with the highest security stack and the biggest budget, and our banks spend upwards of $500 million a year on their security. If you're in the crosshairs of a nation state cyber army, they're going to get in. So the question isn't like, how do we keep playing whack-a-mole, or how do we play whack-a-mole better, or how do these small companies that don't have $500 million cybersecurity budgets defend? Right now they can't. They're on the front line of a real live armed conflict, because cyber weapons are weapons. And they're there without a battle plan, without adequate defenses, without equitably distributed defenses, and without access to intelligence. And that's why I started my company, to fix that.
I think the infrastructure risk is something that I'd love to have you talk more about, because we know that we're giving away our social data and there's all these lists you can buy, but how specifically are other countries looking to weaponize data like infrastructure?
Well, there's the big scary thing probably isn't going to happen. If everyone says, oh, they could take out the grid. Yes, they could. Any of the 4 nation states I mentioned could take out the entire grid and our water systems and our telecommunication systems right now if they wanted, but they don't. The thing I'm most worried about is a gradual degradation to these critical systems. It's hard when you're an American and you have never lived abroad and you don't understand weak critical infrastructure. Ours is so robust, but in other countries, brownout and blackouts and volatile communication systems are the norm. For China, which is an aspiring regional hegemon, they would like to move up. For them to move up, America has to move down. And one way of getting us to move down is to constantly, just incrementally, like water on a stone, erode at our critical functions. And that's what concerns me more than the big scary cyber Pearl Harbor. That's probably not going to happen without starting a world war. And China, I don't know if they want to start a world war with us. I think it's inevitable, but.
So I'll open things up now. Like I said in my note to you guys, you are the experts and the rest of us are just trying to learn from you. Are there, when you think about this topic, and maybe Jackie, I'll come back to you in terms of historical context, but when you think about this topic, are there 2 or 3 issues that you feel, man, I wish every American would keep these 3 things in mind about the historical relationship between China and the rest of the world, or especially between China and the United States? Or is that question too vague? Is that question too vague? And feel free to rephrase it if there's a better form.
No, the bigger the better. I should have said that I started out my career studying ancient Chinese military classics, and have been interested in the history of Chinese strategy and the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party has picked up any of that cultural heritage or has more innovated and developed Marxist-Leninist Chinese communism strategies since the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in the early 1920s. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, because the party was actually founded in 1921, even though the PRC is only 73 years old, as Isaac was saying. So we have 100 years of data about the CCP. And I think one thing to understand when we look back at what it's been up to since then is there's a way of telling the story of its history where supply chain security has been kind of the most important theme, or the most important defense-related theme, because in the 1920s, the way the Chinese Communist Party survived was by or through a united front, as Isaac said, with the Nationalist Party, the other revolutionary party aspiring to take over all of China. And within the united front, the Nationalists led the charge against the other military powers within what we think of as today's China. And the way that they did that was by blockading them, or taking advantage of the fact that they didn't have access to the resources of the whole country, and therefore they could be surrounded and defeated. And then this happened to the Chinese Communist Party itself, and it was almost extinguished or exterminated in the 1930s in the 5th Nationalist Encirclement Campaign. And that's what triggered, you probably heard about the Long March, where the communists had to leave central China and journey on foot for a year plus to get to a kind of northern outpost near Mongolia, where they could be aided by the Soviet Union. But the reason that they had to do that is because they were blockaded, encircled effectively by the nationalists. Then during World War II, at that outpost at Yan'an in Shanxi province, the Chinese were subject to a blockade by the Japanese invading force. And so they were very resource constrained. And then they ended up winning in the Chinese Civil War after World War II against the nationalists by turning the encirclement campaigns against the nationalist forces. Then they won the Civil War in 1949, only to find themselves subject to a blockade or embargo from the United States and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And I could go on, but we haven't had to think too much about being blockaded. We've done the blockading historically. In World War II, we launched Operation Starvation against Japan, and we're a very well endowed in terms of resources country. But for our main competitor, as Gentry says, this is a very central question. And so the Chinese Communist Party strategists think a lot about supply chain security. And I just want to conclude by mentioning that Anna's center translated a speech by Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in April of 2020, about the same time that Xinhua was issuing that thread about masks and pharmaceuticals. And what General Party Secretary Xi said was, we must sustain and enhance our superiority across the entire production chain in sectors such as high-speed rail, electric power equipment, new energy, communications equipment, and we must tighten international production chains' dependence on China, forming a powerful countermeasure and deterrent capability against foreigners who would cut off our supply. So at least in their minds, those are important sectors, and they have to be in control, and they have to have leverage over their rivals by being in control. And to David's point about, we're not going to decouple entirely, that's not realistic. One place to start, I guess, in thinking about where we might want to prioritize is another part of that speech, and this was given to kind of an economic commission, was, and I'm quoting, that is, in sectors and segments related to national security, we must build a domestic supply system that is independently controllable and secure and reliable. So that's what the CCP says it needs or must have. So the challenge for us is to think about what are the sectors and segments related to national security, because as everybody has said, it's broader than just javelins or stingers, although those come to mind because they're involved in the Ukraine fight. It can be as simple as Anna said, pipettes. So thanks.
This is amazing because I think Jackie just did my work for me. The question that I'd love David to weigh in on now, and then Anna, since Jackie quoted from work that your center has done, I'd love you to weigh in on that next. But David, based on the work you guys do at Everstream Analytics, which are the industries that you think, in light of the CHIPS Act and some of the other laws that have passed recently, which are the industries that the United States, and maybe you can lump in Western Europe as well, which industries should governments be focused on trying to decouple as much as possible in the context of what Jackie just said? Yeah,
well, I think the probably the best lens through which to look at that is the output of the administration's study on exactly this. The industries, not just the industries, but the sort of critical products within those industries that rose to the surface as part of that study. And certainly, the idea, anything microchips, there's not much on a battlefield that operates without a microchip these days. So I think that would be arguably top of the list. And again, thinking about the CHIPS Act and the China, Taiwan, and Taiwan's dominance in semiconductors, that's probably top of the list. And the challenges there are a multitude. It takes years to build an advanced fab facility, and great that we're heading down that path in the US and Europe, but we are years away from changing that in any kind of a meaningful way, and even then it will be incremental at best. I think the pharmaceutical supply chain is likely second there, and I talked about active pharmaceutical ingredients earlier on. And one thing that we spend a lot of time with our clients on is helping them understand tier 2, tier 3, tier N dependencies. And for some industries, that's harder to do than others. It without a doubt, it's a big data exercise. It's not about surveying tier 1 suppliers. And it's urgent and it's necessary to bring that type of visibility into every supply chain, but particularly for the supply chains that are most exposed and those that are most central to national security. So I think there's a realization, there's a will, things are being done, but we're on the first rung of this ladder right now. There is enormous challenges ahead to reverse where we've got to.
Thank you. And Anna, what's your take on that question? Which are the most critical industries to try to decouple in terms of supply chains? And I mean, then it raises the other question, which David touched on, which is, if we just talk about advanced chips, is it even possible, given how far behind we've fallen, not just in the infrastructure for those industries and those supply chains, but in terms of the manpower, right? Training people takes time, educating people takes time. I think I read somewhere recently that there's a shortage of electrical engineers because everyone is studying computer science, now. But how should we be thinking about some of those sorts of issues? And again, if I'm asking the wrong question, feel free to correct me.
No. That's actually, I think it's a number of questions that are all kind of stacked like the Russian doll. So I'm gonna work from the last thing that you said. I think you raise a really important issue because what kind of talent do we need for these, whether it be advanced manufacturing or some of the more higher end things. But I would actually posit that, we need to think broader at what is a technically proficient workforce. We've done, CSIP's done a lot of work on AI talent, as well as, I would direct everyone to those reports. But what we're really starting to dig into is, for a lot of these, especially biomanufacturing and some of these others, it's that, you don't need a bachelor's degree for that. And how do we then get a broader representation in areas that have, been underrepresented in the STEM fields, and to build back that manufacturing base. I'm going to now flip to the first part of like, how do we where do we even start in getting a handle on, telling the story? Because I think Isaacs has done a great job of highlighting, Beijing has controlled the story because they've made it a priority to control the story. And, I laugh, like win-win means China wins twice.
Yes,
So,
I remember that. I remember that line as well.
Remember that? Yeah. So I think, we need to shed a light on it and, call out these behaviors and highlight it and, really kind of put out, to the American people and those of us, in open liberal democracies, like what view of the world do you want? And, these supply chains and from things as the high end stuff, but also, pharmaceuticals has come up a lot today. I mean, penicillin, and, some of the other, manufacturing things, we have to stop thinking about the bottom line and thinking about what's the best value, in these supply chains and for the nation. And I think that's really a good place to start. And that's not to say it's easy. It's hard. There's lots of vested interests, and I don't need to tell everyone. I mean, people are still making money, but we have to start taking a slightly longer term approach.
Isaac, how do we tackle this?
So it's a massive problem with boring solutions. Better regulation, better enforcement, and better transparency. Companies often complain that they don't have insight into their supply chain, but that's because they're often not looking, or they're not looking in the right way. It's relatively straightforward, considering the massive problems that companies face, to get really good insight into where your goods come from and to know how much your suppliers are lying to you or not, to check the documents, to trace where the cotton or viscose or solar panels came from. That's one big piece of it. The other thing in terms of DC and the revolving door, we already have phenomenal laws in place for this. One of the things that I found the most heartening that the Biden administration did was suing Steve Wynn, the CEO of Wynn Casinos, for not registering as an agent of China. And the case is still pending. But things like that, even if the DOJ doesn't win, it sends a call to US business leaders who think that they can amplify positive voices about China, suppress negative voices, and not have PR implications for that. So the message that we really try to tell our clients and companies is that this is very doable. This is very fixable. You can have supply chain transparency. You can live up to your values. You can do what CBP and DOJ and Treasury wants you to do. It's going to cost some money. It's going to cost some time. It might require you to reduce your exposure to China, but you've been wanting to do that anyway because of the chaos and the unpredictability of the supply chains. I think it's a very good reminder for people that the reason that so many supply chains are anchored in China is dependability and predictability. And that has not been the case over the last 2 years. It's been the absolute opposite. So if you're making sacrifices to be somewhere because of the predictability, and all of your recent data shows how unpredictable they are, you need to change your model.
I want to ask, what do you have to say to all the people that are assuming we're going to eventually go back to normal? I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation over the past couple of years that there is no back to normal because the root cause is the climate crisis. The pandemic is a symptom. You know, we have a number of symptoms, including the water crisis and scarcity. If you can look at everything as an integrated system rather than individual disparate events that happen to be happening around the world, they all interconnect. How do you address this short-sightedness and get people to actually take action?
So I rarely will bring it up through the lens of climate because it has become so politicized. And I think people often have the mistaken belief that we need to partner with China to fight climate change, as opposed to understanding that pushing back against Beijing is a far more effective strategy of fighting climate change. Rather, I'll talk about it from US-China political tensions and say, regardless of what you want, the US government is set in its path, regardless of who wins. If the Republicans sweep the House and the Senate, if they have a humiliating loss, if it's Trump, if it's Biden, if it's really anyone who has any shot on either ticket, things are going to continue to get worse. And you can still pray for a return to first term Obama, let's have a stronger and more stable China, but you're way out of step with both politics and Main Street. I think people who advocate for, oh yeah, things are going to return to normal, don't look at the very credible polling from Pew and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that show a supermajority of Americans, every age, every political class, every educational class, that have really strong displeasure towards the Chinese Communist Party. And so businesses can think whatever they want. It's a lovely free country that way, but they're just going to be making decisions that go against their values and go against their shareholders, which is not a winning value.
There's a question from Andrew Ancone, and he says, this may be a naive question. And just for context, Andrew is a managing director at Macquarie Capital. So he says, this may be a naive question, but surely the CCP understands that global trade is not a zero-sum game. They lobbied for decades to join the WTO. Surely there is a realization that unilateral actions will result in counteraction and eventually confrontation that leaves everyone worse off.
Yeah, I have some
Take that
thoughts
one.
on that. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
No, go
I think you're
ahead.
probably going to say the exact same
I
thing.
want that one.
Anna's chomping at the bit. Anna, why don't you take it and then we'll
I'm
vote
going to push
Gentry
back on that. They do look at it as zero sum, and that's worked for them. It's worked for them because they have not had any cost put on them, right? I mean, they have CEOs of major companies apologizing left and right, over time. And so I don't think they necessarily joined WTO to acquiesce to the system. They join WTO to reshape it. And you see that across not only trade organizations, but others as well. So
yeah, in
on the floor.
cyber as well at the UN, they have put forth, to establish norms, and the norms that they've put forth are actually pretty good because they want to shape the narrative, and they want to eventually be able to wield the coercive or subversive power, which they're doing really well right now.
So a point on elite politics. For our predictive models, we have to understand that we have almost zero insight into what goes on at the Politburo Standing Committee. And the answer to your question would require us knowing the relationship between, say, Chairman Xi and Li Keqiang. Do the other 5 members of the Politburo Standing Committee admire Xi and want him to take over, want him to have a 3rd term for the key positions, or would they love to depose him? Does Xi have a really good relationship with the 2 vice chairmen of the CMC, the body that oversees the military, or do those 2 men not want to end up like their predecessors, one who died in prison, and think that overturning Xi is the way to go? Do the retired members of the Politburo Standing Committee, like Zhang Gaoli, who Peng Shuai accused of sexual assault, are these still incredibly powerful forces behind the throne, or are they entirely quiet and sidelined? So there's all these really important factors that we really can't have any insight into because of the opacity at the top of the party. And we can just see things with a really concrete and difficult time lag. Winston Churchill described Soviet leaders infighting as pit bulls sparring under the carpet. You don't know who wins until someone spits out the bones. And that's what we have to be with the top of the Chinese Communist Party as well.
It sounds like this
Sorry,
might
Jackie.
be. I was just you read my mind. I was like, Jackie, what do you have to say about all this? Is there anything in China's history that gives us a sense about how this might play out?
Well, there's some interesting scholarly work that suggests that actually, through the longue durée, Chinese emperors have had a more kind of hands-on role, and that the whole idea of the market is not really indigenous or familiar or embraced, or hasn't been. But just looking at more recently the Chinese Communist Party, which is obviously should be our focus. I agree with Isaac. We can't know exactly who's up and who's down in Zhongnanhai these days, but we can look back, as I know he's done, at what some of the architects of the reform and opening were thinking about in the late 70s and early 80s, when Deng Xiaoping, won the succession battle to take the helm after Mao Zedong's passing from the scene. And what's striking now, obviously hindsight's 2020, but these guys were not talking about opening up in the kind of liberalizing sense. They were talking about getting access in a very strategic way to capital and technology, and controlling the degree to which other people outside countries and systems got access to their people. So they were worried about foreign ideas, liberal ideas, ideas about rights and freedom coming in as they were trying to import know-how and money. And they had their own kind of, slogans or concepts for what they were up to. And one of them that, is telling is the economy should only be as free as a bird in a cage. This was Chen Yun, who said, the market can be like a little bird operating in the cage, but the cage, which is the plan, is going to be the structure in which that happens. And we, the Communist Party, are going to control that structure. We're going to continue to make plans. We're going to set forward our goals and ambitions for 5, 10, 15 years out, and we're going to march toward them in the way that only we can. And they also had ideas about how they were going to try to kind of leverage the difference between internal and external prices of goods, and do things that are basically totally inconsistent with their WTO obligations. And yet they kind of, as Anna was saying, they succeeded. They did that with impunity. The issue, I just want to close by saying, I think the issue is, the logical extension of this all is the international system of free trade that they joined, they kind of subverted or infiltrated, distorted from within, and it hasn't defended itself as robustly as maybe we all think it should have. Therefore, or now, it may be ending. And I think they did always anticipate that the logical consequence of what they were up to was something new at the end, or because the system that they were subverting couldn't last forever. Back in 2001, after they joined the WTO, they actually forecast a 2-decade period of strategic opportunity that they thought they would have. So about 2020 was when they thought, maybe this isn't the model that we've been executing isn't going to work anymore. We'll have reached its limits and something new will have to take its place. And I think that's where we are now. And that's why maybe, we have woken up, but we're curious, what's their new model? What's the new model for all the other countries that still believe in free trade? How do we navigate this? I think they have a vision, and Anna knows more than I about this, but I think they have a vision that involves technology and using data. Gentry knows too, what they call the fourth industrial revolution, to kind of set up a new system where they're at the center of it, and the Communist Party calls the shots, not just inside China, but well beyond. And as Isaac says and warns, they've already succeeded to some extent, because Jamie Dimon has to apologize if he makes a joke about the Chinese Communist Party, and Daryl Morey gets fired for expressing interest in the plight of the people in Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
There's a question from Ralph Asher, and I think it's the same Ralph Asher, but Ralph he runs a supply chain data analytics company in Minnesota, and he says, what's the panel's opinion of the Belt and Road Initiative's impacts on global supply chains and China's influence on regional politics, particularly in Africa? David, you've been quiet for a while, so maybe I'll rope you in here to get us started.
All right. Well, it's a big topic. I'll kick it off, and I think first point is, it's a reflection of a number of the points that have been made about China's very strategic long-term view of controlling supply chains, and the crossover between commercial supply chains and military supply chains, and a desire to exert influence beyond their borders. I think there's a lot of this yet to play out, but I think in a sort of more tactical sense, a lot of the projects, particularly in Africa, really have not been a success in terms of deepening their relationships and strengthening their relationships, because of the way in which the projects have been rolled out and what has happened with that. So I would say that the success of it so far has been mixed, but would love to hear some of the experts weigh in on what they think.
Gentry, do you want to jump in on that, or is that something that's beyond? Is that beyond your pay grade, given that you think mostly about cybersecurity?
I have a lot to say about the Belt and Road Initiative, but CSET puts out the best papers. So Anna, I'm a super fan of CSET's work in this area.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, Belt and Road, and I think I'm going to expand a little bit on what David said. Is I think success as far as what was their strategic goals. I mean, we see them expanding, being an alternative model because of the kinds of governments that they prop up in those areas, and that access to resources that they'll then control. I think that's a big part of it.
So is one way to think about and I think it was Isaac who touched on this, is one way to think about this, that, yes, the CCP is thinking about, and maybe they're not thinking about profits in the short term, is one way to look at the difference that the CCP in its thinking is long-term, strategic. We might have to give up some short-term profits to get where we ultimately want to go, versus maybe in the West and liberal economies, we're more focused on, near-term profits, whether it's as an individual, I want to get paid mine now, and so I'm not going to do anything that puts that at risk. Or if it's a company, hey, we want access to this market, and we're going to keep doing what we think we have to do to gain access to that market, even as Isaac again, I think mentioned, that hasn't really played out in the way that some of these large companies might have hoped. Is that one maybe naive and simplistic way to think about it, or am I completely have I completely lost the plot?
So I think it's the opposite. I think
Okay.
China has succeeded for so long despite the Chinese Communist Party, as opposed to because of the Chinese Communist Party. If
Okay.
we're going to have a framework for
Okay.
Chinese recent history, that's how I would do it.
Okay.
I think we sometimes subscribe to this view that, oh, the Chinese are only playing the long game. The Chinese think in decades. If they did, they would be so much less successful, because planned economies almost universally fail. And there's so much more chaos in the Chinese system. And a lot of that doesn't come out because we have folks like Thomas Friedman who will go and be very impressed by how quickly a building gets built and then forget about all the buildings that get built and fall down soon after. Or, my apartment building in Beijing looked like a pre-war building in the US, but was built, I think, 4 years before. It had just degraded so incredibly quickly. And a lot of that gets missed. I think the other issue is that it's easy for us to understand that Democratic Party politicians and Republican Party politicians don't seek to maximize economic value, but they seek to stay in power, and they seek to play politics. And we somehow forget about that with the Chinese Communist Party, where it's so much more the case. So the Communist Party, if one has to boil down why they're doing what they're doing, the reason is to stay in control. And that justifies a lot of what they're doing. And it's a better model for understanding them than economic superiority or will of the people or stability.
That's interesting. And you raise another point, which I think I remember. I think I was still in business school, so this must have been 2008, maybe 2007. And there was concern that I forget exactly what was happening, but there was concern that China was going to sell off its treasury bills, and I assume that now it's invested in more treasury bills, but it had then. And a somewhat simplistic argument I made at the time was that I didn't think that would happen, because if they did, it would hurt the U.S. economy, and in hurting the U.S. economy, they'd hurt their own economy. And I wonder if, and anyone on the panel can jump into this, but I wonder what weaknesses internally exist in China that make it unlikely that everything the CCP wants to accomplish, as far as we can tell, is going to happen. So one issue I think about is the demographic shift, right? That China might become old before it becomes rich. And then another thing more recently, and Isaac, I agree with you that sometimes climate change is dangerous ground to stand on because it's so politicized. That being said, if the drought China is experiencing this year is emblematic of the kind of issues it's going to have to deal with next year and in the future, how do those sorts of things change the way we think about how some of this will play out? And I recognize that's a very rambling, very broad, very, very malformed question, but I'd love your thoughts, and whoever wants to jump in first. feel free to do so.
Can I answer a quick one? I don't think their surveillance, domestic surveillance systems are going to work out well in the end. They have a super huge surveillance world, not just economy, but everything. And they're not watching people because they're interested in what people do. They're learning behavioral patterns to control people later. I just can't wait to see how that one's going to work out. And it's not going to be good. People have free will.
Anyone else, or is that question too scary? Is that question? So Jackie, go ahead.
Did someone say scary? I'm here.
I love that.
And I should say, my research has been for the Defense Department. So, I see it as my job to worry. And when I look at some of those factors you just mentioned, Brian, I think the Chinese Communist Party in many cases is aware of these challenges and has its own way of thinking about how to address them that has, as Isaac said, many flaws, and they certainly have blind spots too. But one thing you can say about their proposed solutions in many cases is that it's very different from how we would think about the issue or how to address it. And in some cases involves doing things that we wouldn't ever do ethically or because of moral constraints, legal constraints, basic political differences. So, just for instance, on the demographic question, it looked as though, for a certain amount of time, one of the solutions was to use the HUCO system, the household registration system, which basically allows the party to at least try to manage who goes where, under what police, and who has rights to certain services and housing in different places, and to use incentives to manage that flow of people. One of the ideas that their demographers have come up with is we're going to take the people who are kind of old and infirm and put them in the countryside along with the very young. So grandparents will be in charge of very young kids. And that way, the people who the social safety net, which doesn't really exist, but the imagined social safety net has to cover or provide for, will be in an area where the cost of living is lower. And so the burden on the state will be lower as a result of this. So we'll have the productive people in the cities where the cost of living is higher and the dependents out in the countryside. But one of the results of that, we now know through the work, in part through the work of a professor out at Stanford, Scott Rozelle, an economist, development economist, is all these kids who are in the countryside with grandparents. In many cases, the grandparents didn't have the greatest education or weren't in great health or were trying to work to make ends meet. And so these kids were basically, in many cases, left to fend for themselves, abandoned. So their health, their educational opportunities were severely compromised. And it's tragic when you think about the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of children who had this happen to them. And then when you think about the climate issue, this is just one quick thought, but all the time it comes back to supply chains. All the time you see the Chinese Xi Jinping, almost every major address he gave for a period of months was about the importance of the harvest, of planting, of food. The Chinese, landmass just has, I don't know the nice way to say this, a crappy endowment in terms of water, clean water. So I think it has only 1/4 or 1/5 the clean water that we have in the United States. It has, for 4 times as many people, only 60% the arable land. And part of that is because, or that's probably going down because of the way that they've degraded their environment. But I think we need to think too about what are the Chinese solutions to this problem or constraint. They're probably going to think about it in ways that will surprise us. Like already we see them doing cloud seed to get more irrigation. Is that okay? Is that good for the environment? Is that further polluting? Yeah. Could that cause more natural disasters? How are they thinking about access to arable land in other countries that are either contiguous with China or not? Yeah. That may be in a position of, through the Belt and Road Initiative, losing some of their sovereignty over parts of their country because they took questionable deals from China. So this is not necessarily, I think the one worry I have when we start talking about these kinds of limits or problems that China faces is this is not a reason not to worry. The fact that they have obstacles may mean that they will choose to tackle them in ways that are extremely problematic for the Chinese people and for us.
Just jumping off on Jackie's great points there, I'm a lot more worried about a weak and paranoid Beijing than I am of a strong and stable Beijing in the near term. In the medium term, I'm quite worried about both. And I think the issue is that some policymakers feel incentivized to strengthen Beijing because they're worried about the country lashing out and, say, seizing Taiwan or attacking Japan because of domestic uncertainty or a need for a rally around the flag effect in China. And so that dictated US policy for a long time. Oh, we're worried about China, so let's strengthen them. And now we're in this situation where a weak China is dangerous, a strong China is dangerous. And I think the other thing I'd like to emphasize, because we haven't really talked about this, and Jackie just brought it up, and I think it's a really important point, the heaviest burden goes to Chinese people. Both in China and globally. And companies really need to be aware of that as they're trying to reorient their supply chains. There's too much of a focus in the human rights world on reporting, getting disclosures from companies. When you do that in China about Xinjiang, you're putting your Chinese partners in danger. So you need to be using open source methodology to gather information. You need to keep your Chinese stakeholders out of the loop, not because they're not brilliant or sophisticated in understanding, but because a lot of this violates Chinese laws and norms. And doing it the traditional way is a great way to see your partners end up in jail.
Wow. That's
maybe
go ahead, David.
Well, just building on what Isaac said and bringing it back to one of the topics that you originally flagged up is, how should startups think about all of this, particularly within the context of supply chains? And I think Isaac makes a really important point there in terms of data and data flowing in and out of China, and companies need to be a lot more sophisticated in terms of how they think about this idea of sort of the sovereignty of data. And it's not just China, there's, Europe, America, everyone's doing it. It's becoming increasingly polarized. But if your supply chain is dependent upon China to whatever extent, and you need to get visibility to that multi-tier supply chain, whether for compliance reasons or something else, then you will increasingly run into challenges in terms of what I'll call getting data out of China. And companies need to be very thoughtful about that in terms of understanding the challenge, how they think about data hosting, what they're prepared to do, what they're not prepared to do. I mean, obviously, Apple and other companies, they've been down that road, but for smaller companies that are providing supply chain analytics, that's a barrier that needs to be considered.
Thank you. Gentry, as the probably the CEO of the most nascent startup on the panel. What's your take on David's comments?
Yeah. Just be very aware. And I mean, like Isaac was saying, I don't know. Yes, startups, I get it. Young startups have a lot on their plate, but this should be a priority. And it's not just your, sorry to throw something awful at you all, it's not just your regular supply chain, your software supply chain too.
Yeah.
Does everyone understand that most software isn't, when you buy software, it's not from one company, that there's lots of different components? So when I say software supply chain, it's everything.
Explain it a little bit, because once we publish and other members get to watch this, there'll be people in the audience who maybe do not know what a software supply chain is. So.
Yeah, it's just being cognizant of the software that you use and the dependencies that the software uses. So some open source software is not as secure as others. How does a regular person know that? I don't know that you can, but it's worth investing in a bit of professional help in that way.
What and I'm asking this on behalf of startup founders who themselves are not technical and might, in the early days, be relying on someone else for some of that software support? What are some of the very basic, very fundamental things that a startup founder should, like, what are the questions to ask if you're relying on someone else to help you get, your MVP or your beta product out before you've raised some capital to invest in a CTO, for example?
Well, I guess it depends. Do you want to protect your intellectual property? Do you have intellectual property to protect? Then maybe don't use offshore help. And then also the brands, the security of the companies you're using. I mean, who would have thought that SolarWinds was vulnerable? That's a big, good, secure company.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hit and miss, but just, I don't know, have an awareness.
You're making me feel like it's everyone for themselves and God for us all.
Well, that's the question. Who is responsible for national security? I mean, we want there to be a gap. We don't want the private sector militarized.
Yeah.
It's a quandary.
Yeah. We're coming up on time. And so maybe for the last 5 minutes or so, what's the final? There's one last question from Jean-Patrice. He's a French student pursuing a degree in global supply chains. He's working on his thesis about reshoring and impacts on supply chains, China, Russia, and beyond the dualistic liberal protectionist view. How do we in the US perceive and organize reshoring policies? Which strategic sectors are vulnerable? Jean-Patrice, you'll have to watch the video. We discussed that a little bit, I think earlier on, but he reminds me of something that we haven't touched on yet, which is also very of the moment. How should we be thinking about the intersection of what's happening, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how that's affecting relationships between the West and Russia, and then the tensions ongoing with China? How should we be thinking about how those two issues intersect with one another and how that might play out in the future? And maybe that's the last thing we do a round robin discussion on.
So as far as we can tell, Beijing sees Russia as an embarrassing little brother and not as the correct model. And it doesn't see the war in Ukraine as the right predictor or influencer of it in China, of it with Taiwan. A couple of things are important with it. One is that it's highlighted for the business community that if or when China invades Taiwan, they might have to leave quickly. So there's a growing demand for businesses to figure out what their China exposure is so that they can make smart decisions in the time of a conflict. I think the second piece is that we should understand US hesitance with Ukraine deters China. I think it's often seen as the other way around, but it seems a lot more likely that Beijing sees US restraint to Ukraine and thinks, oh, I should be less likely to successfully invade Taiwan because the US doesn't want to fight a two-front war, and they're more likely to be involved with the situation in Taiwan because they're not in Ukraine, as opposed to, oh, the US didn't go to Ukraine, therefore they're not going to go into Taiwan.
Yeah, I think I would add to what Isaac said, and I think the way in which the international community has come together in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine sends some level of warning to China. I think that the way it's played out would make them think a bit differently about an invasion in Taiwan. But we certainly, as we walk through this with our clients, back to Isaac's earlier point about a lot of this is very hard to know because of the opacity. It then comes down to really two things. Well, three. One is visibility, really, knowing where your exposures are. The second is scenario planning, to say, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but if this happens or that happens, here's what I would do. And then the third is call it business continuity planning. So if scenario A plays out, what am I going to do? And I have a plan, and I'm ready to go with that plan. I think COVID, one of the many lessons from COVID is that companies had not done that, had not done any of that, and really paid a pretty heavy price for that when it's not difficult to do. And the economic difference between doing it and not doing it can be significant.
Gentry.
Yeah, there's certainly a lesson to learn also about the use of cyber weapons in kinetic battle. So we haven't seen a exquisite, surgical use of cyber weapons the way other people thought. I don't agree with this theory would happen, but yeah, they're certainly studying that.
Anna.
I think it really highlights the importance of, in tackling these really difficult issues, to build those coalitions and really reach out to allies, because we are really stronger together. And that I think that will really be key, because, again, as I said earlier, we have to think about, what vision of how the system works do we want?
And to wrap things up, Jackie, the historian, parting words of wisdom based on your study of history.
I'll do my best. I think that we'll look at Ukraine in part through this supply chain prism, just to bring things back to where we began. And in that regard, as I think I mentioned, I learned about the fact that some people at a think tank in Washington called the Center for Strategic and International Studies had done a study of what it would take, or the fact that we had given however many thousand, I think it was javelins to Ukraine. This was back in the spring. And the fact that depleted our stockpile or inventory by a third, and it would take us years to replenish it. Or some British publications were saying that, I think because of the NLAWs that had been transferred to, and other kit that had been transferred, I think a British commander had said it would be a decade before they could fully equip one of their divisions. And because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't get everything right, but it is very kind of quantitatively oriented in a Marxist-Leninist sense, when they get those kinds of metrics or indicators, they study them and they plug them into their equations about, well, what is their ability to replenish versus our ability to replenish, and what are the inputs that are necessary to have that capacity, and who controls them, and those kinds of inquiries that we're fully capable of and have done in the past. And so, I guess I would say we're on the path to doing more of that, and we probably need to be. And then the other thing I believe that they're looking at, because of their own history and the centrality of having access to key materials or not, would be the degree to which Russia has a get out of jail free card, if you will, or has leverage because of its energy supplies and the dependence of Europe on those supplies. So they are probably thinking themselves in Beijing, how do we put ourselves into the position of controlling some key export like that, such that other countries have to think twice about responding in a way we don't like to something we do, say vis-a-vis Taiwan. So those are, I guess, just a couple thoughts, but I agree with everything that's been said. And I think the main thing is, there's going to be many lessons that come out of the war, and the Chinese are nothing but if not good students and careful students, and so they will probably take this back and do a lot of further study, as will we. So thanks.
Well, on that note, I don't think there's very much I can add. It's 4:01. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for joining us for this discussion. I've wanted to have a conversation like this for a while, and I think I like to believe that the universe unfolds as it should, And so I was frustrated I couldn't make it happen previously, but now I feel as if everything came together at the right time. And I couldn't imagine a better group of people to discuss this with than each of you. So thank you very much. We'll publish this either sometime this evening or tomorrow. We'll post it on YouTube, and then I'll email you with a copy. Hopefully you find it useful to share with people in your own networks. But thank you. I can't thank you enough, to be honest. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, everyone. It was
Thank you very
great.
much.
It
Thank
was,
you very much, Brian.
yeah, it's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.